You know those moments when silence feels louder than words? You pray, you wait, you cry out, but it feels like heaven is closed off. It's as if your voice bounces off the ceiling and falls back on you. And in those moments, a dark thought creeps in. Maybe God has forgotten me. If you've ever felt that way, you're not alone. In fact, every follower of Christ at one point or another wrestles with this ache of being unseen. But here's the truth you need to hold on to. God has not forgotten you. Even when you feel invisible, He sees you. Let me take you to the story of Hagar in Genesis chapter 16. She was a servant, mistreated, cast aside, and she ran into the wilderness alone, forgotten by people, unwanted by her mistress, carrying shame and pain. She felt invisible. But then the angel of the Lord found her by a spring in the desert. Do you remember what she called God after that encounter? El Roi, the God who sees me. Think about that. In the place where she felt most abandoned, God revealed Himself as the one who never loses sight of His children. That's the same God who sees you right now, in the wilderness of your own heart. What if the silence you've been experiencing is not God's absence, but His way of pulling you into deeper awareness that He sees you even when no one else does? Because sometimes, when everything else falls away, His gaze becomes clearer. Now let's be honest. Feeling unseen is one of the most painful experiences. You scroll through social media and see others thriving, getting married, starting families, landing jobs, launching ministries. And there you are, waiting, wondering, questioning. You don't say it out loud, but in your heart, you whisper, "Lord, what about me?" That question is not new. The psalmist cried it too. Psalm 13 verse 1 says, "How long, Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me?" Did you catch that? Even David, the man after God's own heart, felt forgotten. If David could feel it, so can you. But what David discovered, and what you must remember, is that God's silence is not neglect, it's preparation. Think about Joseph, betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, thrown into prison. For years, it seemed like God had abandoned him. If anyone had a right to feel forgotten, it was Joseph. Yet every step, every dark season, was part of a bigger plan. Genesis chapter 39 verse 21 says, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love." Did you hear that? In prison, God was still with him. The presence of pain did not cancel the presence of God. And when the time was right, Joseph was lifted into the very place of influence God had prepared. What if the same is true for you? Could it be that the season you interpret as forgotten is actually the season God is using to shape you for what's ahead? Because unseen does not mean unvalued. Hidden does not mean abandoned. Often it means preparation. The enemy wants you to believe that if you feel unseen, you are unseen. But feelings are not facts. The fact is, God says in Isaiah chapter 49 verse 15, "Can a mother forget the baby at her breast and have no compassion on the child she has borne? Though she may forget, I will not forget you." Let that sink in. A mother could forget her child. Almost unthinkable, but God says, "I will not forget you." That means your name is written on His heart. Think of David again in Psalm 34 verse 15. "The eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and His ears are attentive to their cry." Right now, even as you sit wondering if He notices you, His eyes are on you. Not casually, attentively. That means your sighs matter, your tears matter, Your prayers matter. Nothing is lost on him. But here's the struggle. You don't always see evidence of that. And in the absence of evidence, unbelief whispers. That's why you must remind yourself daily of the truth. Remember El Roy. Remember Joseph's prison. Remember David's lament. Because their stories prove one thing. God sees what people overlook. What would change in your life if you lived as though you were always seen by God? How would your prayer sound? How would your confidence grow? How would your obedience deepen? Living unseen by people is painful, but living unseen by God is impossible. Let me make it even more personal. Maybe right now you feel forgotten in your health. The diagnosis came. The prayers have been lifted, but healing hasn't arrived. Maybe you feel forgotten in relationships. Everyone around you seems loved, chosen, pursued, but you feel invisible. Or maybe you feel forgotten in your purpose. You thought you'd be further along by now, but doors keep closing. Here's what you need to know. You are not forgotten. God's timing is not your timing, but his timing is always right. And while you wait, he is weaving details you cannot see. Think of Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 1. She longed for a child. Year after year, she prayed, but nothing changed. To others, she looked forgotten. Yet Scripture says in verse 19, the Lord remembered her. Did you catch that? In his timing, he remembered. And the child she bore, Samuel, would become one of the greatest prophets in Israel's history. What looked like delay was divine preparation. Could it be that what feels like neglect in your life is actually the setup for a story bigger than you imagine? What if instead of asking, has God forgotten me? You started asking, what is God preparing in me during this hidden season? That shift could transform despair into hope. When you feel forgotten, remember, you are seen. God is El Roy, the God who sees you. His eyes never leave you. His ears never miss your cry. His plans never exclude you. You might feel invisible to people, but you are unforgettable to him. And the sooner you believe that, the sooner your wilderness becomes a place of encounter instead of despair. The next time you feel unseen, instead of letting bitterness grow, whisper this truth out loud. God, you see me. Write it down. Declare it. Let it sink deep into your soul. Because once you live from the reality that he sees you, no feeling of being forgotten will ever define you again. But being seen by God doesn't always mean you'll hear him right away. Sometimes he proves his presence not by speaking, but by staying silent. And that silence can feel even heavier than invisibility. You know he sees you, but when you can't hear him, you start to wonder if he's still near. That's where many believers stumble, mistaking his silence for absence, when in reality, it's something far deeper. Silence is one of the hardest things for a believer to endure. If God would just speak, even a whisper, you'd have something to cling to. But when heaven feels quiet, your heart starts to question. You wonder if your prayers even matter, if your faith even counts, if maybe you've been overlooked. But here's what you must hold on to. Silence does not mean absence. In fact, some of God's greatest work in your life happens in the seasons where he seems silent. Think about Jesus on the cross. As he hung there suffering, he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That's Matthew chapter 27, verse 46. Even Jesus felt that agonizing silence. And yet in that silence, the greatest act of redemption in history was unfolding. If silence surrounded the cross, but salvation was being secured, then you can trust that the silence surrounding your life right now might be the soil of something greater than you can see. What if God's silence in your life isn't rejection, but construction? What if He is building something in the unseen that you'll only understand later? Let's go to the story of Lazarus in John chapter 11. Mary and Martha sent a word to Jesus that their brother was sick. They knew He loved them, and they expected Him to come quickly. But verse 6 says, "When He heard that Lazarus was sick, He stayed where He was 2 more days." Jesus deliberately delayed. From their perspective, His silence and delay looked like abandonment. Their brother died. Hope seemed buried. But when Jesus finally arrived, He performed a miracle so profound that it revealed His glory in a way healing never could. Raising Lazarus from the dead proved He wasn't just a healer, He was the resurrection and the life. What if God's delay in your story is setting you up for a greater revelation of who He is? Now pause and think about this in your own life. How many times have you assumed silence meant abandonment, when in reality, it was preparation? Maybe you prayed for an open door, but God kept it shut because He knew it would crush you if it opened too soon. Maybe you begged for a relationship to work, but God ended it because He knew it would keep you from your true calling. Maybe you cried for promotion, but He held you back because your character wasn't ready to carry the weight. Silence isn't absence, it's a training ground. Could it be that what feels like a delay is actually God's mercy? Because sometimes the very thing you're frustrated about not having is the thing He is protecting you from until the right time. Think about Israel wandering in the wilderness. God promised them the land, but He didn't give it to them instantly. Exodus chapter 23 verse 30 says, "Little by little, I will drive them out before you, until you have increased enough to take possession of the land." God withheld full victory, not because He didn't want to bless them, but because they weren't ready to handle it yet. Sometimes silence is God's little by little strategy to prepare you for what's ahead. Now let's get real. Waiting in silence can feel unbearable. You wonder how much longer? When will breakthrough come? Why hasn't anything changed? But Isaiah chapter 40 verse 31 says, "Those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint." Notice what waiting produces: strength, endurance, renewal. God uses waiting seasons to build something in you that instant answers never could. What if God's silence right now is developing the very strength you'll need in the next season? If He gave you the answer too soon, you'd miss the growth He's producing in the wait. Think about Hannah again. Year after year, she prayed for a child, and heaven seemed silent. But in the silence, her desperation drove her to deeper surrender. When God finally gave her Samuel, she dedicated him to the Lord, and he became a prophet who changed a nation. Without the silence, she might not have reached that level of surrender. Your silence might be producing the same surrender in you. And let's not forget Job. He lost everything: family, wealth, health. And for much of his suffering, God was silent. His friends gave bad advice. His wife told him to curse God and die, and Job's cries seemed unanswered. But in the end, God revealed Himself in power and restored Job's life doubly. The silence was not absence. It was the stage for revelation and restoration. What if the silence in your life is actually God's invitation to trust Him deeper than ever before. Because real faith isn't built when God is speaking loudly. It's built when he seems silent, and you choose to trust anyway. Let me make this even more practical. Think about farming. A seed spends months hidden underground. No sound, no movement, no visible sign of life. But in that silent, hidden place, roots are growing. Strength is forming. Life is preparing to break forth. If the soil could speak, it might say, "Nothing is happening." But when the season is right, the seed breaks through strong and fruitful. That's exactly what God is doing in you during silent seasons. He is forming roots, preparing fruit, and when the time is right, breakthrough will come. Psalm 27, verse 14 says, "Wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart, and wait for the Lord." Do you see the repetition? Wait, be strong, wait again. God emphasizes waiting because he knows how impatient we are. But he also knows waiting refines us, purifies us, teaches us to rely not on feelings, but on faith. God's silence is not his absence, it's his preparation. He is not ignoring you, he is preparing you. He is not withholding out of cruelty, he is delaying out of wisdom. And when the silence lifts, you'll see that he was working all along. The next time you face silence, instead of assuming God has forgotten you, ask this: Lord, what are you preparing in me during this season? That simple shift will turn silence into classroom, waiting into a training ground, delay into divine preparation. Because in the end, silence will not define your story. Preparation will. And when the time is right, what God has been forming in secret will be revealed in power. And once you understand that silence is preparation, there's still one more truth you need to hold on to. Because even when you know he sees you, and even when you accept that silence has a purpose, the waiting can still feel unbearable. That's where the tension lives, between the promise spoken and the promise fulfilled. It's in that gap where doubt whispers the loudest. But it's also in that gap where God's faithfulness shines the brightest. There's a powerful tension every believer lives in, the gap between what God has promised and what you currently see. In that gap, doubt tries to creep in. In that gap, you wonder if you've been overlooked, abandoned, or left behind. But here's the truth that anchors you. God's faithfulness always comes through, and his timing is never late. You might feel forgotten, but the author of your story never forgets a single line. Think about Abraham. God promised him descendants as numerous as the stars. Yet year after year, nothing happened. Decades passed and his body grew old, Sarah's womb barren. From a human perspective, the promise was impossible. But Romans chapter 4, verse 21 says, he was fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised. And in Genesis chapter 21, the promise was fulfilled with the birth of Isaac. The promise was delayed but not denied. God's timing was perfect because through Isaac, the lineage of the Messiah would come. If God was faithful to Abraham after decades of waiting, why would he be any less faithful to you? What if the promise you've been holding on to hasn't happened yet, not because God forgot, but because his perfect timing hasn't arrived? Could it be that delay is actually evidence of his precision, not his neglect? Let's look at Israel again. They groaned in slavery for 400 years, crying out for deliverance. It seemed like God was silent, like he had forgotten his covenant. But Exodus chapter 2, verses 24 and 25 says, God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac and with Jacob. So God looked at the Israelites and was concerned about them. He heard, he remembered, he was concerned. And when the time was right, he raised up Moses to deliver them. Even centuries of waiting didn't erase God's faithfulness. Do you see the pattern? He may take longer than you expect, but he never fails to deliver. Now bring this into your own story. Maybe you've prayed for healing, and it hasn't come. Maybe you've been waiting for a breakthrough in your family, and nothing has shifted. Maybe you've been holding on to a promise God whispered years ago, but doors keep slamming shut. Here's what you need to hear. Delay is not denial. God's timing is not bound by your calendar. He works in seasons, not schedules. And when the season turns, what once looked impossible suddenly becomes inevitable. What if your greatest frustration right now is actually God positioning every detail so that when the answer comes, it will be unmistakably Him? Think about Jesus' birth. For centuries, Israel had waited for a Messiah. Prophet after prophet pointed to His coming, but generation after generation died without seeing it. Then Galatians chapter 4, verse 4 says, "But when the set time had fully come, God sent His Son, born of a woman, not early, not late, when the set time had fully come." God's timing is never random. It's always strategic. If He timed the coming of His Son perfectly, you can trust He'll time the fulfillment of your life perfectly too. And this is where trust becomes essential. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight." Trust means letting go of your timeline and surrendering to His. Because faith isn't proven when everything happens on schedule. Faith is proven when nothing makes sense and you still declare, "God is faithful." Could it be that the test of this season is not whether God will come through, but whether you'll trust Him until He does? Let's circle back to Joseph. After years of slavery and prison, one moment shifted everything. In a single day, he went from prisoner to second in command over Egypt. But here's the key. If that moment had come too soon, Joseph wouldn't have been ready. The delay was actually God preparing him to handle the promotion. In your life, the moment of breakthrough might also come suddenly. But you must trust the years of delay are shaping you for that day. Now think about your own journey. What if the closed doors, the unanswered prayers, the long nights of wondering are all preparing you to carry the weight of what's coming? What if the very things you resent are the things God is using to refine you? His faithfulness doesn't always look like immediate answers. Sometimes it looks like strengthening you in the waiting so that when the answer comes, you're ready to steward it well. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 23 says, "Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for He who promised is faithful." Notice the focus is not on your ability to hold on, but on His character. He who promised is faithful. That means even when your grip feels weak, His grip on you never loosens. What if God's faithfulness isn't just about what He gives you, but about who He becomes to you in the waiting? Because often, the greatest gift of delay is intimacy with Him. Let's not miss this. God's faithfulness is not tied to circumstances. It's tied to His character. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13 says, "If we are faithless, He remains faithful, for He cannot disown Himself." His faithfulness is who He is, not what you do. That means even in your weakest moments, His promises stand. God's timing is perfect, His faithfulness is unshakable, and His promises never fail. You might feel forgotten now, but when the set time fully comes, you'll see that He remembered you all along. Let me leave you with this challenge. Write down the promises you're waiting on. Next to them, write this declaration. God is faithful. His timing is perfect. And whenever doubt whispers that you're forgotten, read it out loud. Let it anchor your soul. Because when you feel forgotten by God, you must remember this. You are seen. His silence is preparation, not absence. And His faithfulness will always, always come through. Hold on. Your set time is coming.